But let's expand on one of those headline stories now. Police Minister Bheki Cele is saying he's shocked by the lack of adherence by shebeens and taverns as well as restaurants to the alcohol regulations during lockdown, and now vowing to crack the whip to ensure that the rules are followed. Some experts have commended the restrictions, particularly because of the relief experienced by trauma units at hospitals when the country went completely dry during level 5 of the lockdown. Professor Charles Parry is the director of the Alcohol, Tobacco and Other Drugs Research Unit at the South African Medical Research Council. For more than 20 years, he's urged government to relook at those regulations around alcohol trade. He joins us now via our video link from Cape Town. Prof, thanks very much for your time. Welcome to the AM report. In some instances, you're being described as an alcohol epidemiologist. What does that mean?
Thanks, Ayanda. Basically, one of the parts of my job is to study what's happening with alcohol, how many people are using it, how that's changing over time, and looking at the burden in terms of various harms, premature death, injury, violence, and so on. Cancers, I was on a call relating to alcohol cancers yesterday. So we're basically looking at, the burden of alcohol and the patterns of use, and we particularly have a situation with problematic alcohol use in this country.
Absolutely.
Drinking.
Right, and that's where I was actually going to initially begin. We've got these long-standing issues around what some academics are describing as a functional alcoholism within South Africa. The question then becomes, given the heightened conversations during COVID-19, what are we doing to address that aspect of this discussion? The fact that perhaps we need to come to grips with the fact that alcoholics or alcoholism in South Africa is more widespread than we're willing to admit.
Yeah, in 2 words, we're not doing enough. Basically, there is some talk now about, there will be plans to change the maximum blood alcohol level for drivers. And there's a little bit of talk about moving ahead with the stalled liquor amendment bill. But basically, and the Western Cape is talking about some revising its Liquor Act. So there is some discussions happening, but really it's not enough. We need to look at in so many areas to address this problem. Basically, we're the 6th highest nation in the world in terms of the amount of alcohol drunk per drinker per day. And that's on average 5 to 6 standard drinks. And that's a lot of alcohol. And that's really the situation we have. And there are various factors that are driving that. And those are the ones we need to look at addressing.
Right, and we'll do that in just a moment. As a start, where do you think the weaknesses are? Is it because alcohol is just simply too cheap and accessible? Is it because the regulations have too many holes in them? Is it because perhaps players in the alcohol industry just wield way too much power and can't be held accountable?
Exactly. I think the last point is probably the most important. The government has tried on various occasions to move forward on tougher regulations around marketing, around drink driving, around perhaps even raising the drinking age, but they haven't been entirely successful. And one of the huge reasons behind that is the pushback from the industry, which tends to support interventions like education, which is not particularly strong evidence-based strategy. And so I think we need to get to grips with the pushback from industry, and the government needs to do its job of governing and develop good policies and then actually implement and enforce them. That's the problem. We have laws around drink driving 0.05, but they're not properly enforced. We need to probably reduce them somewhat, but then enforce them. Alcohol is way too cheap in this country. I was hearing about something yesterday called Rooidoppies, which is very cheap white wine, and that's sold for under 3 rand a standard unit. And that's the problem. It's so cheap. It's so easy to get drunk in this country. We've got to look at pricing. We've got to look at rampant lifestyle marketing of the industry. We've got to look at container sizes. We've got a problem with selling alcohol very cheaply in large containers. We need to look at, do we need to have 6 quarts of beer and 1 liter beers, and even now from Heineken a 1.5 liter Magnum. Certainly our research has shown that heavy drinking is related to factors such as larger container sizes.
It might be quite remiss, according to many people, not to mention the very strong social political history that South Africa has with alcohol consumption. Things like the DOP system that were used during the apartheid era. Speak to us about the systematic channels that were created to create dependencies on alcohol, and whether or not, we've been sober enough in our conversations to address that head on.
Yeah, I mean, that is part of our history. We need to understand that. I mean, there are two things we can talk about. For example, one would be the DOP system, the legacy of the DOP system, where in certain farms, the wine farms, the labor was partly paid in alcohol for their services. That doesn't continue now, although certain workers get credit and they can buy alcohol on credit and pay the farmer back later. But that has created a legacy which is part of the problem. But perhaps even more important are things like the migrant labor system and the bringing people in to work on the mines, and then setting up sort of beer halls, which is a sort of form of entertainment. And that created dependency because people have lots of time in the evening. They're not with their families. They will go and socialize and drink, and that created part of the problem. And then there were practices of the government which set up the beer halls, which were used to fund the townships. And so there's been a large, and then there was sort of prohibition, which helped create sort of the shebeen industry, and that's created a very complex sort of alcohol environment, which is part of our history. But there are a number of strategies I think that we can implement to deal with this and get a better regulatory environment. No one's saying we need to prohibit alcohol, but it needs to be in a situation where so much of it isn't consumed in heavy drinking situations. And I think we even have parts of the industry which are dependent on heavy drinking themselves for the profits. And that's parts of the big alcohol players, and also people selling it in the retail sector who actually depend on their customers getting drunk in order to keep that's part of the business model, to make the profits that they or their shareholders depend on.
It's very easy sometimes, Prof, in these conversations to almost take a moral high ground, and I guess that's why you had to emphasize that this is not necessarily a call to ban alcohol altogether, but perhaps an invitation to have a bit of a more nuanced conversation about how we're consuming alcohol. Speak to me about the police minister's comments yesterday. He appeared to be highlighting specifically taverns and shebeens. Given the complex scenario you've just outlined, how do we then place those comments? How do we make sure that the conversation does move forward and, leads to material change?
Yeah, it's not just those environments. Those are problematic. The taverns are selling on to illegal outlets, so that's a huge source of how the liquor supply chain happens. It goes through taverns, they sell out the back door, and it's resold again through shebeens. Shebeens are unregulated. Many of them operate sort of very irregular hours, and children are in the vicinity. That's part of the problem. And certainly crime data has shown a strong link between drinking, particularly in and around shebeens, associated with violence. But it's not just there. We also have areas in inner city areas, long streets, very late selling of alcohol, where there's lots of alcohol is consumed over many hours, and it's problematic. And so we need to address the ways in which alcohol is sold. Part of it, the government needs to do a better job of regulating it, closing down outlets which are operating without an outlets which are operating outside of the hours of sale, and they need to lose licenses if they found to be selling to an underage youth. The first offence, you close the outlet down for a week, for example, if it's found selling to someone under 18, and you really have strategies which will bite if people don't adhere to better environments, so that those who do want to consume responsibly or safely can do so without it being completely prohibited. And we need to look at marketing practices, selling alcohol, lifestyle selling it. We need to have conversations around that too.
Yeah, and hopefully this is the first of many conversations to come. Thanks very much for your time and for coming on to the AM Report. Professor Charles Parry is Director of Alcohol, Tobacco and Other Drugs at that unit at the South African Medical Research Council. Prof, once again, thanks very much indeed.